So guys, we'll start.
Yep. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's only just after midday. It's that middle of the day business. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much to Amnesty International for hosting this important event. My name is Alison, Professor Alison Scott-Bowman from SOAS, and I'm not important at all today. I'm just here to act as the introducer. So here today we have Dr. Leila Etelhaj, the Director of Prevent Watch and also the Senior Caseworker, so the collector of evidence and the analyser, and Professor John Holmwood, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Nottingham. Together, they've produced this amazing People's Report of Prevent. And in the room with us today are some of the people who supported them and cheered them on. Prevent has not been reviewed since it was first initiated in 2003. It was sort of reviewed, well, it was revised in 2011 slightly, so it hasn't really been tackled to see whether it works. In 2019, the government announced a review of Prevent, and then there was a 4-year wait. So when appointing the reviewer, I don't know if you want to talk about that later with the panel, but in appointing a reviewer, they showed themselves really to be governed by ideology rather than the desire to choose somebody who was experienced and who understood the terrain. That official review was boycotted, which you probably know, by over 500 organisations. I can talk later in the question and answer session if you want about why my team and I, because we've done a big research project, didn't boycott it, but that's another story. And so over 500 organisations and experts from across the spectrum of attitudes. So it wasn't only people who opposed Prevent who boycotted the review. It was also people who understood that the process was not going to be conducted accurately and fairly. So the People's Review of Prevent was a productive response to the boycott. 2 aims: give a voice to those who are influenced, affected, whose lives are damaged. Over 45,000 individuals to date have been referred to Prevent. That was the one aim. And the second aim, to address the concerns of civil society and academics. There was a suspicion that might not be addressed properly, and again, I can tell a story about that later if you want to hear it. There's possibility that expertise would not figure large in the Shawcross review. So a year ago, after waiting, hoping to come out with Shawcross, after waiting, in the end, the People's Review of Prevent was published a year ago, and finally last month, the Shawcross review was published. Very disappointing, but very predictable, in that it made recommendations which were based on lack of evidence, and it made recommendations which were also arguably ideologically biased. You probably know that the far right was considered by the report not to be a risk. So I think I should at this point hand over to the real experts. Who's going to go first?
Yes, well, I'll go first. Thank you very much, Alison. I mean, our response to the Shawcross report is detailed and extensive. What we wish to do was to subject it to a critical analysis of its arguments and evidence, the evidence used as the basis for its recommendations. And in the course of that, what we hope we have shown is that those recommendations have no secure basis, and indeed, if the evidence had been properly analysed, would support very different conclusions. I think it's fair to say that it's a really very poor report. It's partisan, but it's also partial. It's supposed to be a comprehensive review of Prevent, and yet it shows itself to be either unwilling to examine some aspects of Prevent or not knowledgeable about them, which is quite shocking. I'll just give 2 examples. For example, the Commission for countering extremism, an important aspect of the government's prevent strategy, and yet its reports, its publications, its activities are not reviewed at all within the Shawcross report, notwithstanding that he makes recommendations about changes to its role and function, changes which are of the most important and damaging nature, which we'll come on to. The second thing is, although he analyses community cohesion projects, he seems to be unaware that the Home Office has organised its community cohesion programmes under the umbrella of Building a Stronger Britain Together, and has done so since 2016, and that programme has been evaluated twice during the period since then, in 2019 and in 2021. There's no mention of this at all, and insofar as there's a review of community cohesion programmes, it relies on evaluations done in 2017 and newspaper reports about them. So it really is highly problematic. So our main purpose and our summary of our conclusions, I'd say, is, well, at the outset one can see that the report is framed by a neoconservative ideology, and that framing leads the report and its recommendations into a distinctly authoritarian direction, notwithstanding that what Shawcross announces at different points is that Prevent is about defending liberal values. The Shawcross report is a deeply illiberal product. This authoritarianism is evident in proposals that Muslim-led civil society organisations are extremist and Islamist simply by virtue of their expression of Islamic normative commitments and by virtue of political activism, especially when opposing government policy. So there's a direct attack upon Muslim-led civil society organisation. It's imbalanced in its approach to freedom of expression, which it defends for right-wing expression, but not for those expressing Islamic views and values. And all the way through the report, it represents normative Islamic commitments as Islamist. The argument that Prevent should focus less on right-wing extremism and more on Islamist extremism also reflects that neoconservative framing and is explicitly discriminatory. And what we show in our response is that there's no basis to it in terms of the data put forward in the report. The claim that the threat posed by Islamist extremism is greater than that of right-wing extremism just simply isn't sustained by the data in the report. For example, there is a higher referral of right-wing extremism onto the Channel programme for de-radicalisation than there is for Islamist, so-called Islamist extremist referrals. And that process is one dominated by counter-terrorism policing and the security services. So the very group that Shawcross is most endorsing is a group that in its own practices is showing that it regards right-wing extremism more seriously than so-called Islamist extremism. The report states that individuals deemed at risk of radicalisation should be treated as susceptible rather than vulnerable. This is something that was pushed forward into the media for 6 months prior to the publication of the report. And it's a really problematic argument, but taken together with the argument that those who express vulnerabilities without a political ideology, which is another aspect of what Shawcross says, that people with mixed or unstable ideologies are really simply vulnerable and shouldn't be part of Prevent. Prevent should only be directed at those whose attitudes reflect a clear political ideology. What we suggest is that that argument suggests that logically supports that the conclusion that the prevent duty should be removed from schools and health service. After all, that's where vulnerabilities exist. Around a third of referrals to prevent come from schools. It's presented in schools as a safeguarding obligation. Safeguarding is about vulnerabilities. If Shawcross decides that is an appropriate way of framing prevent, then the logical conclusion is withdraw prevent from schools and cease the securitization of children and their development. Also, the claim that I should add to that, because Mr. Shawcross has been unfortunate in the nature of different reports that have come out since. So Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, has been looking and has just issued a report about a week ago about children and young people being brought into the criminal justice system. Unlike prevents, where individuals have committed nothing unlawful, these are people who have broken the law, usually the law associated with non-violent terrorism. And Jonathan Hall recommends that they should be treated as vulnerable rather than susceptible. They shouldn't be treated in the criminal justice system, and indeed terrorism legislation is inappropriate for addressing the kinds of behaviours and attitudes reflected by very young people. So it's not simply that we're saying, well, remove prevent from young people, remove the criminalisation of young people, but also that senior other official or people with official positions are arguing. The claim that recent high-profile terrorist cases show that prevent has failed is also false. Most are indicative of failures in counter-terrorism policing and the security services. Again, Volume 3 of the Manchester Arena inquiry came out shortly after the Shawcross report. He was anticipating that it would be aligned with what he said. He cites evidence that was given to the Manchester Arena inquiry, but evidence given doesn't mean that the judgment is going to find that the evidence was sound in what was argued. And indeed, the Volume 3 of the Manchester Arena inquiry did not find failures with prevent. It found failures with the security services. Yet what is Mr. Shawcross proposing? He's proposing that prevent should be placed more thoroughly in the hands of the security service. And again, it's worth recalling, because today is the publication of Louise Casey's report on the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police have responsibility nationally for counter-terrorism policing. What does Dame Louise Casey say? Unless the Metropolitan Police are thoroughly reformed, that should be taken away from them. And yet what do we have? A proposal that there should be a stronger influence of counter-terrorism police. So we think that those recommendations are misplaced and premature. And the recommendation to centralise prevent under the Home Office and to reduce local authority autonomy by placing prevent on a regional basis, because that's one other major area of the recommendations, reverses the existing direction of travel under Operation Dovetail, which has been moving towards local autonomy, did so after the first initial Manchester City Council-based report on the arena bombing. And yet, Shawcross doesn't really evaluate those pilots, and that was designed to reduce the pressure on the security services who were becoming overloaded with prevent. And one could say it's also inconsistent with the implementation of prevent under the devolved jurisdictions of Wales and Scotland, but particularly of Scotland. Finally, I think, and this is, a fundamental point and actually related to our location here, prevent represents a serious threat to civil liberties. Yet the Shawcross report places it under what is in effect a political commissariat. We're used to the idea that in British politics and American politics too, we have things like policy SARs. One could say that Sarah Khan at the Commission for Countering Extremism was a policy SAR. But the transformation of the role of the Commission for Countering Extremism to be responsible for the direction of PREVENT across government departments and vertically down through to regional commissions and so on, is in effect the creation of a political commissariat. It was somebody outside the civil service will be responsible for directing administrative politics. And if you ask, how is the Shawcross recommendation that there should be less emphasis on right-wing extremism and more emphasis on Islamist extremism going to be delivered, given that he provides no new definitions of extremism, no identification of how that can be brought about? It can only be brought about by the central directing power that is now being vested within the Department of Homeland Security. I shall now pass over to Layla.
Thank you. Thanks. So today we published our report, which is approximately 80 pages. It's on the People's Review of PREVENT. It's just been uploaded. And we published this response to Shawcross. We didn't actually expect it to be so long. We thought we would be able to respond to it in a few thousand words. But unfortunately, given how many flaws and how many of the arguments just are not rooted in any evidence, we had to go through quite a few more pages in order to get the job done. So we were fortunate enough that we didn't have to draw back onto a lot of the evidence to show how PREVENT doesn't work and all of the harms of PREVENT, because we'd already published this last year as part of the People's Review of PREVENT. And so how we structured this report was simply to address some of the key concerns that we had with regards to what Shawcross's recommendations were. And the evidence boxes, instead of being testimonies from clients, as we did with the People's Review of PREVENT, were evidence boxes showing how evidence that was available to Shawcross actually contradicts some of the conclusions that he has come to. So when we think about the fact that the evidence available to Shawcross and some of the logical conclusions that he should have come to were not the conclusions that and not the recommendations that he made as part of his report, we have to wonder why that is. And it leads us to the conclusion that this report was completely ideologically driven rather than an evidence-driven report. So when we consider that, it's actually quite serious, because we know that as researchers, as academics, as civil society, when we're trying to access evidence and data around PREVENT, it's a very difficult process. There's so much opaqueness around it. There's so many barriers in order to access this information. And all of that information should have been readily available to Shawcross, but he doesn't use, as John mentions, he doesn't use a lot of reports, he doesn't refer to them, whether those are deliberate omissions or because he has a lack of knowledge in PREVENT, full stop, is something that we don't know, but we do know that he's failed to draw on a lot of these reports. So one of the conclusions that we've come to in terms of our response is that the report, the Shawcross report, should be withdrawn. And so we publish our report today alongside a joint letter that's been signed by over 200 civil society groups and community organisations and experts calling for the withdrawal of the Shawcross report. And we think we have very strong evidence to call for that, and it's a very easy ask given how poor the report actually is, the Shawcross report that is. So one of the conclusions that John mentioned was this idea of having oversight and direction that's coming from this political commissar, as we're calling it, and this idea comes in as a recommendation from Shawcross at the expense of what would be a more logical recommendation, which would be to have statutory oversight and regular reviews of Prevent. He doesn't even recommend that, and so you have to ask why. Ironically, Prevent is often pushed forward as a way of protecting and promoting liberal values, and the Shawcross report in and of itself is very illiberal in terms of the way it has positioned itself and some of the recommendations that it's come to. Again, Prevent is promoted as a part of community cohesion, and yet we see that Muslims are being targeted, Muslims who are already being treated as second-class citizens in Britain are being further targeted by his conclusions, and we conclude that this is extremely dangerous. Not only is it trying to regulate and control how Muslims self-organize, how they express themselves politically and just practice any kind of activism. And so we think that this role of the political commissar, which is actually being proposed to be taken over by the Commission of Countering Extremism, which in and of itself already has many, many flaws and many criticisms about the way in which it positions itself. None of the Commission for Countering Extremism has been reviewed to suggest that that should even be, if there was going to be this political appointment, that that should be the right person for the job. So none of that has come into his report. Two of the main things that we find in the report is that schooling and healthcare, even by the evidence that Shawcross presents in his report, that he does actually present in his report, he should have come to the conclusion that at the very least, Prevent be withdrawn from schooling and healthcare. Instead of coming to that conclusion, he does some gymnastics about the word susceptibility versus vulnerability. Apologies. And it's really quite an important point, because just looking at the evidence, or the data, that's been recently published, last year, over 1,000 children under the age of 14 were referred to Prevent. When we did the math, bearing into consideration that there's less than 200 school days per year, that means that at least 6 children are being referred per school day in England to Prevent. And so the impact, and we've shown what the harms are to children already as part of the People's Review of Prevent. It's already well established how children are disproportionately targeted and how this is harming them. So that should have been taken on board as a serious consideration. The fact that he presents the evidence to show that actually Prevent is useless in schools should have come to the natural conclusion that at the very least it be removed from schools. Also, there's this conflation that Mr. Shawcross continues to put forward. It's a conflation we see often in the media between Pursue and Prevent, and he only further perpetuates that conflation throughout the report in order to try and frame it as if, Prevent needs to be strengthened in order to stop some of the terrorist attacks that have slipped through the net, and that these were failings of Prevent, and the only way we can get around them and stop some of these tragedies and some of these very well-known terrorist attacks that have happened is to strengthen it and to have more control and to have security services more involved in Prevent. And as John mentioned, Manchester Arena inquiry has already suggested that those failures were firmly in the hands of the security services who were already involved. So to suggest that security services have more involvement where they were already involved and had terror attacks run through them where they were aware of the perpetrators before they committed the attack makes no sense whatsoever. So based on all of that, we are calling today, as part of our report, as part of the joint statement, for a moratorium on the implementation of Shawcross's recommendations, bearing in mind that all 34 of the recommendations were readily accepted by the Home Secretary. It's important that both Houses of Parliament look into what we have put in terms of our response to Shawcross as to how and why the Shawcross report is so flawed, both evidentially and in terms of the nature of its arguments, and understand the risks that his recommendations have, not just for Muslims, but for broader civil liberties and human rights, and call for its immediate withdrawal. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much, John and Leila. So, do any of you have any questions, queries, comments to follow up from this? Because this is a pivotal moment in the work of trying to hold our government to account, which is what a democracy should be about. And you can help us with this. So, any comments, any questions, queries, any clarification? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Simon Hooper from the Middle East Eye. I'm interested that John mentioned the Casey review of the Met Police this morning, particularly in light of what the report says about Manchester Arena inquiry and how that followed up issues with security services and police. I noticed that point about Casey recommending that their oversight of counter-terrorism policing should be changed unless they review. I just wondered more widely whether the conclusions of that report, I don't think it mentioned Islamophobia specifically. I think there was an example in there of a police officer who had bacon put in his boots or something. But that wasn't framed within a kind of wider concern about Islamophobia. I wondered whether that echoed concerns or criticisms that you found within the People's Review of Prevent or Prevent Watch about the attitudes of Metropolitan Police officers involved in Prevent, in implementing the Prevent strategy, and also whether you felt, as a consequence of the Prevent of the Casey review today, whether there's a need perhaps for more scrutiny of specifically Islamophobia within the Metropolitan Police.
Absolutely, I think so. I think the Casey review is very powerful, and what it's starting to do is to show how public policy in Britain has been dictated by a few think tanks, and in particular by Policy Exchange. So when referring to the neoconservative framing of the report, essentially it's different kinds of statements by Policy Exchange. One of them significantly recently, and it finds its way, or its assumptions finds its way into Shawcross, is the argument, is an argument against staff networks within the police, particularly the National Muslim Police Association, the National Black Police Association. So what we have is Dame Louise Casey arguing that there's deep-seated racism, misogyny, homophobia in the police force, and at the same time we have leading think tanks arguing against the self-organisation of minority police officers in seeking to combat that. And indeed, the Shawcross report is very clear around, I mean, it takes the issue of Islamophobia and the hostility to the idea of a definition of Islamophobia into a new place, arguing that a call for a definition of Islamophobia is blasphemy, is a new blasphemy law in effect by the back door. So it's really, I think, quite extraordinary. And I think, actually, I start to think that we need an inquiry about the role of Policy Exchange. After all, it's the architect of the boats policy in relation to immigration. It's pushing strongly the criticisms of the Equality and Human Rights Court and so on. So there's a series of things that trace back, and gradually the threads of those arguments are being pulled away and it's unravelling. And Shawcross is actually, I think, at the moment in which that has happened.
Thank you. Does that answer? Because you answered several questions. Did you want to know a little bit more about attitudes?
I'll just draw on the point of implementation. I think it's very easy to look at the implementation of Prevent and to see a lot of Islamophobia kind of coming through, especially with regards to some of the questions that are being asked people referred to Prevent, be that by Prevent officers or by the people who are initially referring them. I think that framing allows us to see the Islamophobic part of Prevent as if it's a bad apple type situation, whereas prevent is inherently Islamophobic. We're not looking at bad apples, we're looking at a very diseased tree, the roots of which are infected. That is where the Islamophobia is coming from, and so naturally it works its way up, and we can't expect it to bear any other fruit except for that very bad apple that we tend to point at and say, oh, you know, it's a few police officers. When it comes to counter-terrorism officers themselves, they have referred their own colleagues for normative Islamic practices. So, for example, there was a report, I think only 2 months ago, or maybe 3 months ago, which reported on how a counter-terrorism officer had reported his colleague who had just came back from pilgrimage and started growing a beard, and how dare he offered presents to his fellow colleagues. That was a referral to prevent by counter-terrorism officers. So this idea that somehow if we place counter-terrorism officers and firmly embed them within prevent, there will be less mistakes made in terms of how prevent referrals come to fruition is completely flawed. They themselves are perpetuating that Islamophobia, and I think a lot of the reason why they're perpetuating that Islamophobia, not just because it exists within the Met or within other institutions, but because the logic of prevent is very Islamophobic. It was created for the Muslim community, right? And it has always been for the Muslim community, and Shawcross is bringing it back round full circle by saying we need to refocus it back on the Muslim community.
Thank you very much. There was a question here. Yes, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sir William Shawcross, and I'm the Executive Director of Rights and Security International, and we've been very pleased to be talking to Prevent Watch about these various steps in the research. So 2 observations and then a question. First observation, I think I'm tempted to say, as RSI, that the independent review was neither. We had found emails, which we disclosed. So we got these emails from a Freedom of Information request showing that the Home Office, and indeed apparently then Home Secretary Pratik Patel herself, was quite deeply involved in looking at drafts, and we're still trying to find out what exactly the Home Office contributed to those drafts. And on the review point, it does look as though the majority, I think, of what Shawcross cited was policy exchange or Henry Jackson Society materials. And so it seems that the methodological flaws are so clear. For example, he critiques one organization that's running a project for women and girls, and all he does is look at their website without even attempting, it seems, to contact the organization and talk to them about why they're doing what they're doing. And I think there's a particular dismissal of women's work, women's expertise, especially the expertise of professions that are heavily feminine. In this report, where he just looks at psychologists and says, well, they have nothing valuable to contribute, and looks at teachers and says, well, we don't need to listen to them. So there really do seem to be some very, the methodology seems so easy to puncture that in some ways I wondered if it's worth engaging with it. Second observation is we also obtained data from a Freedom of Information request about the racial impacts of prevent. That data must have been available to Shawcross if it was available to us. It was disclosed to us last November. So there's no reason he couldn't have gotten it had he been curious. But the only mentions of racism in the report, except for one other fleeting one, is his fretting that people aren't referring to prevent because they worry that they themselves will be cast as racist. And so he's worried more about the referrers than the referees. And I'm curious about why you think perhaps he didn't choose to engage in such an obvious issue. And then my question is, so he proposes that we center ideology more in prevent, but what is your sense of what that actually looks like? Because when I read his report, I didn't get a sense of what does he intend, just for prevent officials to argue more with people about ideology. What do you think the Home Office actually intends to do when it comes to supposedly trying to change somebody's ideological views? Thank you.
Lily first. Thank you very much.
Do you want to go first, John? Yeah, so we were really glad that RSI had published the FOIs literally just before we were sending our response to Shawcross to the designers. So we did incorporate that. I think there are a lot of reports and information that, like you say, were available to Shawcross. He chose not to reference them. Throughout the report, he says, I feel, I agree. I mean, there were some statements that he said, you know, he'd make a statement and say, oh, the evidence shows this, or this report shows X, Y, Z. I disagree. That's it. It's like, okay, move on to the next section, which was really bizarre because I don't think anyone would get away with writing a report like that, let alone somebody who's supposed to be writing a report on what is being called one of the most important arms of the counter-terrorism strategy. It's insulting to anyone who works anywhere. I'd say it's even insulting to undergraduates who have to write a report because none of them would be able to get away with writing a report so poor, in such a poor way, in such a subjective manner. And it's really insulting, actually, to anybody who's been involved with a terror attack, to the loved ones of those who have lost their lives in terror attacks, to suggest that somehow this report is going to create any type of safety or security. So yeah, I think I'll let John think on the rest of the report, points that you mentioned.
Yes, I mean, it is strange methodologically. It's also strange in how it presents itself. I was checking back, looking at different reports to see how they presented the team that were involved in reports. And most reports actually list the researchers that are involved in it, and they're either provided by government departments or they're provided in some cases, for example, the Sewell report that had lots of special advisors from different government departments involved in the construction of that report. Shawcross makes no mention of who the secretariat of the report was, nor does he list what any of the submissions to the report are. And bear in mind that the boycott came at the end of the Carlisle's period of evidence gathering. So most organisations had already made their submissions. So the boycott was of cooperating with what followed on from Shawcross. And in his methodological appendix, he states that he had all the material from the first wave of the Carlisle headed review. But he doesn't list what that material is, nor does he provide any analysis of it. Normally you provide an analysis of what is argued and so on. So yes, and indeed the data, it makes statement. I mean, it's as bad as you say. There was data he could have got, and then he says things like, "Oh, I'm going to ask the Home Office to provide some of this data and categorization in the future," and you think, but that's what your review was about. You could easily have taken this data, you could have subjected it to a much more systematic secondary analysis. I mean, the report is, it's very, very poor indeed, and just on the basis of its methodological and intellectual poverty, I think the Parliament should ask for its withdrawal.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Mr. Carson from the Islamic Rights Commission. Just one comment. I mean, with everything that you said, it seems to be that in this democratic state, we've got that the reason that Shawcross was perhaps appointed, I suggest, is that there is so much arrogance in the Islamophobia and racism that they can perpetuate and they can get away with, because that's where we are in terms of the different reports that are coming out across different arenas, not just in this. So what we see is a landscape which is quite problematic in terms of the direction the society is going and where it's heading. Prevent was like, we termed it as a Stasi police state, because every single, whereas in the Stasi state people were embarrassed by what came out, here we've got people in the educational system, in the health system, everywhere else, doing the referrals and making this actually happen in a major kind of way where Shawcross, the reason Shawcross was appointed was to make sure that this would be that arrogant stamp that this is what we can do, we can get away with. One of the questions, which is, I guess you termed it as a tree which has roots in terms of Islamophobia. I think that's a nice analogy. One of the roots, I'm just wondering, in terms of the issue of Zionism-inspired kind of Islamophobia that actually has manifested itself in various ways, whether it's the IHRA definition that's being, many universities are adopting and so on and so forth in the academic world, without the academics actually challenging the rigor and the issues that actually have been very clearly articulated. How does that feature, and what's your perspective on what's going to happen with that particular aspect of it as we go forward?
I mean, I think it is extraordinary. So that and the issue that you raise is really serious. So if we say, well, let's take Mr. Shawcross at his word, let's not impugn his motives and so on, and say that he sincerely thinks a definition of Islamophobia would be problematic, even though he's happy with the definition of anti-Semitism that many feel is really seriously wanting. But then the counterpoint to not wishing a definition of Islamophobia is, well, what is your replacement term? And the general one is anti-Muslim hatred. There is a cross-departmental group in a cross-ministry group looking at anti-Muslim hatred through the different aspects of government departments. You cannot find any of their reports. It's as if they've said nothing and analysed nothing for several years. The section on anti-Muslim hatred in the Shawcross report is mainly about anti-Semitism. So it's really peculiar, because what he does is segue from the idea that right-wing extremists might express anti-Muslim hatred to the idea that the issue of anti-Semitism is specific to Muslims. He refers to panel observations he made, just 6 observations of a panel, but he doesn't say anything about the context in which that was occurring, what kinds of cases were before those panels, and so on. So you have unsubstantiated and what I would say are effectively accusations by association with no identification. And one suspects that his definition of anti-Semitism is, of course, to do with issues of support for Palestine and so on, i.e. in relation to the IHRC definition. But it's an aspect of the poor quality of his report that he doesn't actually give the definitions that he's used. So he debates anti-Semitism without any statement of the standard against which he's judging it. He discusses anti-Muslim hatred and immediately moves on, and suddenly it all becomes, as was just pointed out, an issue of how fear of being called racist means that you don't wish to report, and all the evidence about Prevent looks as if it's the opposite, that people report people to Prevent because the initial point is a risk-averse thing. Well, you report somebody, and actually it goes through a process, and that process insulates you for taking responsibility for your initial decision. I think, however, that what Shawcross has done should send a chilling note to all those involved in teaching, health service and so on, who've been trained in Prevent. The legitimation of Prevent as safeguarding, that you're doing something that's protective of the person that you're reporting, has been undermined by Mr. Shawcross by saying that it's a public safety issue, not a safeguarding issue.
Do you want to comment at all on this later or not?
Only briefly, I'll be less gracious than my co-author John in terms of the intentions behind the definitions. I think the vagueness of terms like extremism and any definition about what Islamophobia is, or even accepting that it exists, is deliberate, because it then allows for the goalpost to be continuously moved. And we see this in the Prevent referrals. If somebody's being referred for ideas of extremism, it means whatever the referrer thinks extremism is. And you can continually move that goalpost when you don't have definitions in place. So I think this is a deliberate move to just continue on with that vicious cycle of referrals, and each time something is reported in the media or whatever government of the day suggests is extremism at that particular point can then be used and weaponized. So I think it is a tool of weaponization to leave those terms to be as vague as they need them to be in order to just maneuver as they wish. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
My name is Anas from Cage. Cage alongside men faced, I guess, the wrath of Shawcross in the report, framing us as kind of like Islamist radicals and extremists and so on. And one of the things that his report tries to do is create a framework by which you can understand Islamism, right? And I think he lists about 10 points, which he says identify and define what are Islamist beliefs. And they're fairly kind of mundane Islamic beliefs, framed fairly suspiciously, deliberately to kind of obscure what he's attempting to do here. I recognise in the report you do make mention of extremism, which is tied to the definition of Islamism. And I know the report doesn't make a contribution in terms of what it believes extremism should be defined as. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts, since you did present a particular kind of framework of understanding from Manchester Inquiry, which is obviously from the kind of, which was proposed by William Wilkinson, who has a particular track record anyway on Islamic issues. But I was wondering if you, as the author, reviewing the evidence, had any thoughts in terms of how we can respond to the issue of defining extremism, whether definitions have been required. I know that the feature in the report, I was thinking maybe more informally you could share some ideas.
Thank you.
Well, I'm happy here to take a lead from Mr. Shawcross. I would say, first of all, begin from an assumption of freedom of expression. So one should not be challenging, or one should not be have a state-directed program against views which are lawful. So why would you have a definition of extremism when what is being expressed are perfectly lawful views? Extremism should not be challenged by an arm of the state. Extremism should be challenged by public debate. It should be that different groups are equal within the public sphere, able to put forward their views. And one of the things that most of the research shows about debating views is actually debate gives rise to greater convergence of views and so on, and tolerance towards others and so on. So we're not calling for action against right-wing extremists or action against other extremists. It's perfectly right that there should be action against behaviours which are unlawful, but it's really bizarre to have state-sanctioned and state-directed actions against lawful views. And it's extraordinary that Shawcross in the report actually attacks civil society organisations who think that state-directed action against extremist views is a problem. That's the very definition of illiberalism, state-directed action against lawful views. So I don't want to get into a definition of extremism, because that's just a definition of the spectrum of political beliefs that exists, and also that all groups, whether they're Muslims or Jehovah's Witnesses, have the right to expression of their views within the public sphere. So I think that is our bottom line. That's what it means to defend freedom of expression. And what are we getting now with the government is a defence of the freedom of expression of only the views that they favour. And that isn't real freedom of expression.
I think as well, just to add, that it is a lovely deflection from what he's supposed to be looking at, which is prevent. And prevent says on the tin that it's supposed to stop people being drawn into terrorism. And there is this continual conflation with extremism, what extremism is, what it isn't, despite the fact that the conveyor belt theory has been debunked, there's no need for him to then try to suggest that, oh, you know, there's these people who have these so-called extreme ideas regardless of what he calls them, because unless he can provide, or anyone else can provide, some evidence that these extreme ideas, whatever they are defined as, then go on to cause terrorism, then it's completely outside of the scope of what he was tasked to do.
Thank you. Please.
What Blair has just said, the prevent duty obviously is a terrorism duty. It's in the CTS Act. What shocked me about the Shawcross report, if I was overseeing that report, I would want to cross-reference the prevent data with terrorism data, and he doesn't do that at all. And you could quite easily look at the number of 18s who've been convicted for terrorism and conclude that by removing prevent from the school system, you wouldn't be adversely increasing the risk of terrorism. So I think that's a very simple thing that is not done. Secondly, because it is part of the Counter-Terrorism Act, you would think that prevent would be part of the independent review of terrorism's duty to review, not think tanks or people linked to think tanks, which is obviously very problematic. I don't understand why it's still not within the remit of the independent review of terrorism to review the prevent duty, if it indeed it is about bringing an end to terrorism. It's just staggering beyond belief that that's not happening. So there's no effective review process about a fundamental part of the terrorism legislation, and there's this constant conflation, as Lena said, between extremism and terrorism. So you start off with a terrorism duty, and everything else is a debate about extremism. So that it's not being linked back at all to traditional ideas.
Do you have a question, or?
I mean,
Yeah.
because
Ask this question.
it is significant that every independent reviewer of terrorism legislation has commented on the fact that this is outside their remit and it ought to have an official standing. Policy Exchange organised a discussion of, you know, what comes after the Shawcross review a few days after it was published. Lord Carlisle absolutely went out of his way to say the one thing there should be is a statutory annual independent review of prevent. So it's quite extraordinary that that has not taken place, and it's extraordinary in the context where, I mean, Professor Conor Gearty in his forward to the People's Review of Prevent that we published last year is that the prevent operates in the pre-criminal space, and in operating in the pre-criminal space, it operates in that space that we used to call freedom. It's a restriction on freedom. It can't be anything. It can't be anything else. And it's a restriction on freedom that is being made the responsibility of the executive arm of government without any kind of protection. And so it's part of, I think, a general civil liberties issue. It's a part of a general human rights issue where the government, I think, doesn't respect the rights of minorities, but only believes in the idea of majorities as presented in terms of their parliamentary support. And that's how groups come to be scapegoated. So there is a view that, oh, well, you know, if you scapegoat Muslims, you can succeed in populist politics. And I think that is part of what is happening. I just want to make one connection because it hasn't been drawn out. The really sad case of the primary school teacher who committed suicide is prevent related. And how it's prevent related is that the school went from outstanding to inadequate on the basis of its failing in one category. and that category was leadership with regard to safeguarding. That process of being able to downgrade a school on the basis of its failing in one item, where that item is safeguarding, goes back to the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair. After all, the school at the centre of the Birmingham Trojan Horse was successful in all categories, was downgraded to inadequate on the basis of safeguarding, and that's the story for that really sad case in Reading. So, you know, there are really serious issues for us all. Obviously, visited upon Muslims in particular, but it's things that, you know, everybody in Britain who believes in civil rights, and one would wish that that was a majority rather than a minority, ought to be arguing for the withdrawal of Prevent and the disruption of freedom that it represents.
Want to comment on this or not?
No, I'm good. I think we're going to wrap up.
We're just going to wrap up now.
I think there's one last question. Should we just take
Question
that?
here? Can we take that?
Sorry, Rick from this as well. One question I have today, you spoke about children and the impact this is having on children when it comes to Prevent. Could you talk about the geographical spread of where you're finding cases of children being reported? Is it in predominantly Muslim majority areas? I mean, probably could be, but I mean, we could say here like where you've noticed the trends in terms of those reports.
I mean, the majority of we have just over 630 cases now that have been reported to Prevent Watch, and the majority of those are Muslims, and they are from predominantly Muslim areas, mainly from the Prevent priority areas. We are seeing more non-Muslims also contacting the helpline. They're facing similar issues of children making comments and then being referred for far-right extremism, and in one case we had someone who was referred for both far-right and Islamist extremism at the same time on the same referral form. So yeah, it is predominantly Muslim areas. I think that example just highlights how confused even the referrers are when they're making these referrals.
Can I just, oh, you have a good question from online? Yeah.
So there's a few questions that come in online. It seems that the government is going to take on board all recommendations. Is there anything in terms of next steps? I'm summarising the questions, but is there anything in terms of next steps that we can help to stop that onboarding all the recommendations?
Well, I think support the call for a moratorium on the recommendations, support the call for withdrawing the Shawcross report. It has become easier to push that forward because of other reports that have come out that are in direct contradiction of what is being argued in Shawcross. I think what it's necessary to do is to connect the Shawcross report, to connect the Shawcross report with the Manchester Arena report, to connect that with Dame Louise Casey's report, and to identify that we have a crisis of policing in this country. I mean, policing also, I mean, the issues of Prevent in schools are also associated with school exclusions, police officers within schools and so on. So I think there's a range of issues that it's now urgent that we bring them together. They're not separate issues which different communities face differently. They're the same issue across communities, and we need a coalition on that basis, and we need politicians to actually be a bit braver themselves. I mean, one of the issues is a lack of bravery amongst our politicians in calling out some of this stuff. I mean bravery in the face of the warriors of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and so on.
I've got an answer to that as well. I think the other thing that we can do is to use the evidence in the People's Review of Prevent. Just to give you one small example, we gave evidence. There were 3 Muslims. There was a six-man crew who did the research across the university sector, and we gave evidence because a lot of people who talked to us on university campuses were frightened. This is when Prevent first came in, so 2015 in its new form, and we felt we should bear witness to what they had the courage to tell us. So if you read the People's Review of Prevent, you'll find out one of our really important findings, which was dismissed by Shawcross. And this is a finding that Prevent generates its own unpleasantness, nastiness, because we did an online survey of over 2,000 students across the whole of Britain, and we got interviews and discussion groups that were 140 hours of evidence. That's a lot of stuff. Analysed it all very carefully and realised that there's an interesting measure here that about 1 in 10 of students on British campuses are Muslim, over 2 million nationally, 1 in 10 of them are Muslim. Also, about 1 in 10 of the students from this sample believed that because Prevent existed, it seemed to authorise and justify suspicion of Islam and Muslims. So the students who were likely to say that they didn't know what Prevent did. If you asked them to describe what Prevent did, the majority of students hadn't got a clue. So there's a democratic deficit here. The students having stuff imposed on them and they don't understand it. But that didn't stop them giving opinions. So there was a minority who really stuck out, who said, yes, Prevent is necessary, terrorism on campus is a problem, and we are suspicious of Muslims and Islam. And that was a little package of beliefs, which suggests really, I think, that Prevent generates its own hatred, and that's that kind of material which is in here. We need to disseminate that. We need to read the report regularly and tell our friends about it and tell media about it if possible. So that's my answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're done. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was the conclusion. Thank you for being a lovely audience, great speakers.
Thank you.
Very important moment. Thank you for being here.
Well done.